The jungle breathes at night, not like a living thing breathes, not the way your chest rises and falls. No, it breathes the way old places breathe, slow, patient, like something that has been waiting for a very, very long time. It is 1968, deep in the central highlands of Vietnam. A four-man recon team from the 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile has been moving through triple canopy jungle for 11 hours. No contact, no enemy movement, nothing. The kind of silence that should feel like relief. But Specialist 4th Class Ronald Decker from Dayton, Ohio, did not feel relieved. He felt watched. He later told his platoon sergeant, and I am drawing from his recorded testimony here, that the watching did not feel like enemy eyes. He said, and these are the words that ended up in a declassified psychological evaluation filed 6 weeks after this patrol, that it felt like something that was older than the war, something that did not care about the war at all. The other 3 men on that patrol never gave a full statement. One requested immediate transfer the next morning. One stopped speaking almost entirely for the remainder of his tour. The third filed a single sentence in his after-action notes. 7 words. It was not an animal. It was not a man. So, what did they see? Before we go any deeper into this, I want to know something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city, your country, in the comments. I read every single one. Every single one. And actually, one more thing. What time is it where you are? Like right now, as you are watching this. Morning? 2 in the afternoon? 3 in the morning? Because honestly, the time someone chooses to watch a video like this tells me a lot about them. Drop it below. Today's like goal is 10, that is all. Just 10 likes. If this story earns that from you, that is everything. That is what keeps this channel alive and growing. And if you are new here and you have a thing for mysteries that are documented, real, and deeply unsettling, hit subscribe. We go deep on this channel, always. Now, let's go back to where this all began. The Vietnam War's Central Highlands. The years between 1966 and 1971. This is the Kon Tum province. Dense, almost impenetrable jungle covering the Annamite mountain range. Elevations between 3,000 and 6,000 feet. Humidity that never drops below 90%. Temperatures that swing from brutal midday heat to a cold that surprises you at night when your sweat-soaked uniform has nowhere dry to go. The 4th Infantry Division operated extensively through this terrain. So did Special Forces units attached to MAC-V SOG, the Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, which was the classified unconventional warfare command, running long-range reconnaissance deep into denied territory. These were not inexperienced men. They were among the most extensively trained soldiers the United States military had ever fielded in a jungle environment. The Montagnard peoples, the indigenous highland communities, who had lived in these mountains for centuries, before the French arrived, before the Americans arrived, before any outside force arrived. They had a name for what lived in the deep jungle, the Người Rừng, the forest people, or, depending on the specific community and dialect you are speaking with, sometimes translated simply as the wildmen. This is not a metaphor. This is not mythology being used loosely. These were documented accounts, collected by French ethnographers as early as the 1910s, describing large bipedal figures, estimated between 7 and 9 feet tall, that moved through the canopy zones of the highland forests and were never, in any recorded encounter, the first to show aggression. The war did not create the Người Rừng. The war simply put trained observers with firearms and military-grade optics directly into the terrain where these sightings had been reported for generations. And then the reports started coming in through military channels. But it was not the enemy that these soldiers feared most in those mountains. The Viet Cong had a silhouette every soldier could identify. They had weapons, they had doctrine. They moved like soldiers move. What moved in the deep jungle moved differently. His name was Staff Sergeant Earl Morrison, 26 years old. From Bristol, Tennessee, he had been in country for 7 months by the time the incident was documented. 7 months of patrols, firefights, ambushes, and the particular kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones when you have been sleeping in the jungle for half a year. He was not a man who scared easily. His commanding officer, Captain Dale Dobbins of the 1st Battalion, 8th Cavalry, later described Morrison as, quote, among the most composed and reliable non-commissioned officers he had served with. I want you to hold that. Composed, reliable, this matters. The account I am about to share with you comes from Morrison's own written statement, submitted voluntarily to a unit intelligence officer in August of 1969. It was not a report filed under orders. Morrison asked to file it himself. He said he needed it documented. The statement was preserved in unit records and later reviewed by researcher John Lutz, who included it in his 1975 collection of anomalous sighting reports from Southeast Asia. Morrison was on a 3-man listening post that night. A listening post is not a patrol. You do not move. You find a position, you go still, you go silent, and you monitor. You listen for movement, for voices, for anything that tells you what is coming toward your unit's perimeter before it arrives. They had been in position for approximately 4 hours. It was between 2 and 3 in the morning. No moon. Visibility at ground level was essentially zero. Morrison was operating entirely on sound and the faint ambient light from a high overcast sky. And then the jungle went quiet. Not quiet the way it gets when the rain stops. Quiet the way it gets when something very large is nearby, and every living creature within a quarter mile has decided, all at once, without a signal, to stop making sound. Morrison wrote that he felt it before he heard anything. A change in the air. Not wind, not temperature. Something he could only describe as pressure. The way the air feels before lightning, but without the electricity. Then came the smell. He described it as wet fur, mud, and something beneath those two things that he had no word for. Something old. Something that did not belong to any animal he had encountered in the jungle before. He did not wake the other 2 men immediately. He raised his hand in the signal for freeze. They were already frozen. They had already smelled it. The figure emerged from the tree line at approximately 40 meters. Morrison wrote, and I am using his exact language here, he wrote that his first thought was that a tree was moving, because the scale was wrong. His brain refused the correct interpretation for several full seconds because the scale was simply wrong. Whatever was standing at the edge of that clearing was not the right size for a human being. It was not the right size for any animal he could name. He estimated the height at between 7.5 and 8.5 feet, heavily built. Dark matted hair or fur covering most of the body. Bipedal, walking upright, not hunched the way a large ape walks, fully upright, the posture of something that had always walked that way. It moved into the clearing and stopped. He stood there for what Morrison estimated as 90 seconds, though he acknowledged his time perception may have been distorted. It turned its head slowly, left then right, the way a person surveys a room when they enter it. Not the rapid scanning of a startled animal. Deliberate, unhurried. It did not look at the listening post. Morrison wrote this with what reads like genuine relief, even on the page decades later. It did not look at them. It looked past them, through them, or perhaps simply did not register 3 motionless men pressed flat to the jungle floor as anything worth acknowledging. Then it walked on, into the tree line on the opposite side of the clearing, without sound, without haste, without any of the crashing, breaking movement that anything that large should have made moving through dense vegetation. It was gone. Morrison did not speak for the remainder of the listening post-rotation. When they returned to the perimeter at first light, the other 2 men went directly to their bunks. Neither of them put anything in writing for 2 weeks. When they finally did, their descriptions matched Morrison's in every detail that mattered. The height, the build, the smell, the silence, the way it turned its head. Pause for a second. I want to know what you think happened out there. Right now, in the comments. Was it psychological? Something combat stress created in Morrison's mind? Was it an animal, a known species behaving in an unknown way? Or was it something else? Something we do not have a clean category for yet? Drop it below. I am not going to answer that question. Not yet. Let's see what the records actually say. Now I want to take you somewhere else. Not Morrison's listening post. A different patrol. A different unit, 14 months later. And I want you to be there. It is October 1970. It is 0245 hours in the Daktu area of Kontum province, and a 6-man long-range reconnaissance patrol from the 5th Special Forces Group has been stationary for 3 hours in a hide position, overlooking a trail junction. Their mission is observation only, no engagement unless directly compromised. They are deep, deeper than most units operate. The nearest friendly position is 11 kilometers behind them. Specialist Dennis Trujillo, 22 years old, from Albuquerque, New Mexico, is on the north-facing watch. He has been awake for 31 hours. His hands are steady. His breathing is controlled. He is doing exactly what he was trained to do. The temperature has dropped. Not dramatically, not the way it drops in a desert night, but enough. Enough that the moisture in the jungle air is sitting just above the ground in a low mist that reaches about knee height. The kind of mist that makes distances impossible to judge. The kind that turns a tree 60 meters away into a silhouette that could be anything. The team's point man to Trujillo's left slowly raises one fist. Stop! Something is there. Trujillo does not move. He does not blink. He shifts only his eyes, not his head. Toward the tree line the point man is watching, and he sees it. It is standing at the far edge of the trail junction, just inside the tree line, where the canopy begins. At this distance, in this light, with this mist, the silhouette is not perfectly clear, but the outline is wrong. Everything about the outline is wrong. The width of the shoulders, the length of the arms, the height. Trujillo later states that his first instinct, the trained instinct of a soldier who has spent 18 months learning to read human silhouettes at distance in low light, was that he was looking at 2 men standing one directly behind the other. Because a single figure could not be that wide across the upper body. A single figure could not have that shoulder-to-hip ratio and still be standing on 2 legs. But it is standing on 2 legs. Upright. Still. 30 seconds pass. The figure does not move. The jungle around it does not move. The mist curls around the base of the tree line in slow, indifferent patterns. Somewhere far to the east, so far it is almost nothing. Artillery fires a single illumination round that briefly pushes a pale light across the sky. Not enough to see by. Just enough to confirm the silhouette one more time. It is there. It is real. And it is looking at them. Not scanning the way Morrison's figure scanned. This one is looking directly at the hide position. Trujillo is certain of this. He writes later that certainty arrived the way cold arrives, not gradually, all at once. The team leader, lying 3 meters to Trujillo's right, makes a hand signal. The signal means, hold. Do not fire. Do not move. Hold. Trujillo holds. His thumb is on the safety of his car 15. The safety does not move. He cannot make himself move it. He writes later that this confused him more than anything else about the encounter. He was not a man who froze. He had never frozen in contact. But his thumb would not move. He describes it as if his body had made a decision that his training had not prepared him for. His body had assessed the situation and concluded that making a sound, any sound, including the click of a rifle safety, was the wrong thing to do. The figure tilts its head, slowly, the way a person tilts their head when they hear something they are trying to understand. And then it steps back, 1 step, into the tree line, the way a person steps back from a window when they realize someone outside can see them looking out. And it is gone, not crashing through vegetation, not retreating quickly, gone the way a candle goes out, present and then simply not present, with no sound to mark the transition. The team does not move for 40 minutes. When they finally extract, none of them file an anomalous contact report. Their after-action report notes the trail junction as clear, no enemy activity, mission completed without incident. Trujillo writes his account privately, in a letter to his older brother in Albuquerque, 3 weeks after returning from that patrol. His brother keeps the letter. Decades later, His brother gives it to a researcher from the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, who publishes it in their 2001 database under report number 2528. It is still there. You can read it yourself. What I have just described to you is not an isolated incident, not even close. Once you start looking through the right archives, the right veteran memoir collections, the right field reports from units operating in the Central Highlands between 1966 and 1972, a pattern emerges that is genuinely difficult to dismiss, not because each individual account is unassailable, but because of the consistency across accounts from men who had no contact with each other, who filed their observations through different channels, and who in several cases never spoke publicly about what they saw at all. The first additional account comes from a Marine Corps scout sniper team operating in Quang Nam province in 1967. 2 men, a shooter and a spotter, experienced. Their observation log, preserved in regimental records reviewed by veteran researcher Gary Mangiacopra in his 1990 monograph on anomalous field reports from Southeast Asia, contains a single entry dated March 14, 1967, that was flagged by the unit's intelligence section and then quietly buried. The entry describes a figure observed through a Redfield 3-9 power scope at approximately 200 meters during an early morning observation. The spotter's notation reads, height estimated 8 feet plus, bipedal, no visible equipment, no weapon, did not respond to movement near its position. Behavior noted, passive. The entry ends there. No follow-up, no official classification, just that single careful notation from a man trained to observe and record exactly what he saw. One new detail in this account: the figure did not respond to movement near its position. Whatever the scout snipers did to test its awareness, it did not react the way an animal reacts, and it did not react the way a human reacts. The second account is older. It does not come from an American soldier. It comes from a French colonial military officer, a Lieutenant Colonial named Victor Burton, who was operating in the same Kontum Plateau region in 1918. Burton's diary, portions of which were translated and published in a 1961 French academic journal on colonial administration in Indochina, contains a passage describing an encounter during a survey operation in which local Montagnard guides refused to continue into a specific valley. When Burton pressed them for the reason, the guides described large figures that lived in the deep forest and that the highland communities had maintained a formal, generations-old policy of non-confrontation with. Burton dismisses this in his diary as superstition, but he also notes, with obvious discomfort, that his own team observed what he calls a very large upright figure at the edge of the survey zone. He writes that he chose not to investigate. He does not give a reason. He simply moves on to the next day's entry. One new detail. This was 1918, 50 years before the American War. The same terrain, the same description, the same Montagnard policy of deliberate avoidance that had apparently been in place for as long as anyone could remember. The third account introduces something that no individual psychological explanation can fully contain. In 1971, a unit of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN soldiers operating in the same Highland zone, reported an encounter to their American advisory team. The American advisor, a Special Forces sergeant named in declassified Corps program documents as Sergeant First Class William Hartley, forwarded the report up his chain of command with a cover note recommending a formal inquiry. The recommendation was declined. The ARVN soldier's account was classified under a category that Hartley later described in a 1987 interview conducted by a Vietnam veteran oral history project at Texas Tech University as the category they used for reports that were too specific to ignore and too strange to explain. The official classification stamped on that report was Misidentified Wildlife. Misidentified Wildlife, 8 feet tall, walking upright, observed through military-grade optics by trained soldiers, making no sound in dense vegetation, displaying no flight response to firearms. Misidentified wildlife. That classification applied to not just one but to multiple reports from the Central Highlands over a 6-year period. is itself a kind of evidence, because you do not create an official category for something that only happens once. So let us think about this seriously, because these men deserve that. They were not storytellers, they were not attention seekers. Most of them never spoke publicly about what they saw at all. So what are the actual explanations on the table? There are 4. And I want to walk through each one honestly, including where each one breaks down. This is the explanation the military defaulted to, and in fairness, it is not a weak one. The research on combat psychology and perceptual distortion is extensive and well documented. Dr. David Marlowe, who served as chief of the Department of Military Psychiatry at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, published findings on what he called stress-related perceptual anomalies in combat populations. His research confirmed that extreme sleep deprivation, sustained threat exposure, and the neurological state produced by prolonged high-alert vigilance can cause the human brain to construct threat signatures from ambiguous visual information. A tired, hypervigilant soldier can perceive a large, threatening figure where there is nothing but shadow and tree line. This is real. This is documented. This is not something to dismiss. But here is where it breaks down. The psychological explanation accounts reasonably well for a single soldier, operating under sustained stress, reporting a single sighting. What it cannot account for is multiple soldiers across separate units, with no contact with each other, across years of time, describing the same figure with the same specific details, the same height, the same fully upright posture, the same complete absence of sound in movement, the same passive, non-aggressive behavior, same response of trained soldiers choosing not to fire. When Dr. Simon Wesley of King's College London reviewed the literature on shared perceptual events in military populations, his conclusion was that reports of this type and consistency across this kind of distribution almost always indicate a shared external stimulus rather than internally generated experience. When many separate people describe the same specific thing with this degree of detailed consistency, the most straightforward explanation is usually that there was something specific there to see. Theory 1 is not sufficient on its own. Southeast Asia is one of the most biodiverse regions on Earth, and the 20th century history of species discovery there is genuinely remarkable. The saola, a large forest bovine sometimes called the Asian unicorn, was not known to Western science until 1992. The Vukwang ox, another substantial mammal from the same highland forest zone, was formally described in 1993. These are not small, easily overlooked creatures. These are large animals that spent decades moving through a heavily observed region without being formally catalogued by science. The central Highlands jungle, particularly zones effectively abandoned by all human activity during the heaviest years of the war, would have been an ideal refuge for animals displaced from lower elevations. Wartime no man's land is, ecologically speaking, a sanctuary. A large primate, a subspecies not yet in the scientific literature, moving through triple canopy jungle at night? In 1970? Not an impossible proposition. But here is where this theory breaks down. The behavior. Consistently, across every account in both the military record and the pre-war ethnographic record, the figure walks fully upright, not the knuckle-walking gait of a great ape, not the forward-leaning posture of a large primate moving at speed. Fully erect bipedal locomotion, sustained over distance. No known primate outside the human line does this habitually. And the silence. Every account, without exception, notes the complete absence of sound in the figure's movement through dense vegetation. A large animal moving through triple canopy jungle at night does not move silently. The physical mechanics of body mass against vegetation simply do not allow it. This detail alone separates these accounts from any known large primate behavior on record. Theory 2 takes you partway. It does not take you all the way there. The documented history of psychological operations in the Vietnam War is rich and strange enough that this theory deserves serious consideration. Mac V. Sog ran programs that sound, in retrospect, almost impossible. Project Eldest Son seeded enemy ammunition caches with sabotaged rounds engineered to explode in the chamber. Operation Wandering Soul used recorded audio of ghostly voices played through the jungle at night, deliberately exploiting Vietnamese cultural beliefs about the spirits of the unburied dead to demoralize enemy fighters. These were real declassified programs. Both sides understood the tactical value of manufactured fear. So, could someone have constructed and operated an 8-foot figure, some kind of apparatus or costumed performance, specifically to unsettle American patrols operating deep in the Central Highlands, for a single incident, in a single location, with significant nearby logistical support? Possibly. But here is where this theory collapses. The timeline. Lieutenant Burton's diary from 1918. The Montagnard oral tradition stretching back centuries before the first American arrived in Vietnam. No psychological operation created the Người Rừng. Whatever was generating the military sightings of the 1960s and 1970s had a name, a documented behavioral profile, and a community protocol for safe encounter management long before there was a war to exploit it in. The war did not bring this into existence. The war brought observers into terrain where it was already present. Theory 3 is the weakest of the four. Intellectual honesty requires including it. The timeline alone disqualifies it as a complete explanation. The Montagnard peoples of the Central Highlands maintained detailed oral traditions about the deep forest that French ethnographers began systematically documenting in the early 20th century. The work of researcher Georges Condominus, who spent years living among highland communities and published his ethnographic findings in 1957, includes passages describing the Người Rừng not as myth or cautionary legend, but as a known category of forest inhabitant, something that existed alongside human communities in the highlands, something that the communities had a protocol for, something they had learned across generations of living in those mountains not to disturb. The protocol was not complicated. If you encounter the Người Rừng, you do not run. You do not raise a weapon. You go still. You wait. You let it move on in its own time, because it will. It always does. That protocol, that exact behavioral sequence of a passive encounter followed by the figure voluntarily withdrawing. Does that sound familiar to you? Every American military account we have walked through tonight describes precisely that encounter, not a variation. Not something approximate, the exact same encounter, the same beats in the same order, that the Montagnard communities had been describing and preparing their children for across centuries of living in those same forests. This theory is the most unsettling of the four, not because it is the most dramatic, but because of what it removes. It removes the war as a cause. It removes American soldiers as the first people to see this. It removes the entire 20th century as the origin point of anything. Whatever was seen in those jungles was not produced by combat stress or military operations. The war simply sent trained observers with modern equipment into terrain where something had already been living and being carefully, deliberately avoided for a very long time before they arrived. None of these four explanations fully accounts for what multiple trained soldiers, men who had faced direct enemy fire and had no professional or personal incentive to fabricate encounters that could have damaged their military careers, said they saw in the Central Highlands of Vietnam. Not one of them, not completely. Stay with me, because the final account, the one that was only declassified decades after the war ended, is unlike anything we have covered so far tonight. This one comes from someone whose actual job was to evaluate these reports officially and decide what to do with them. And what he wrote in an internal document that was never meant for public eyes is the thing that makes all of the others make a different kind of sense. If you have made it this far with me, genuinely, thank you. Hit that like button right now. Let's keep going. In 1974, a year after the Paris Peace Accords formally ended American military involvement in Vietnam, a retired Special Forces officer named Major Robert Sherrill submitted a personal memorandum to the Army's Office of the Adjutant General, requesting that a specific category of field report from the Central Highlands Operational Theatre be formally reviewed and reclassified. Major Sherrill had spent 3 tours in Vietnam. He was not a man given to unverifiable claims. His service record, portions of which became accessible through Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1990s, documents a career built on precision, discretion, and a consistent pattern of being trusted with things that were not discussed openly. His memorandum was 6 pages long. 5.5 of those pages were redacted when the document was finally released in 2003 under a FOIA request filed by independent researcher Chad Arment, whose work on cryptozoological reports from military operational zones is the most systematic treatment of this category of material in the published literature. What remained unredacted was a cover page, a single paragraph on page 2, and the final sentence of the memorandum. The single unredacted paragraph on page 2 reads, and I am paraphrasing here because the full language is technical and bureaucratic, but the substance is this. Sherrill had personally reviewed 41 separate anomalous contact reports filed by units operating in Kontum, Pleiku, and Quang Nam provinces between 1966 and 1972. Of those 41 reports, 37 had been classified under the Misidentified Wildlife category. He had cross-referenced those 37 reports against available zoological surveys of the region, against known large mammal behavioral profiles, and against the available psychological literature on combat stress-induced perceptual anomaly. His conclusion, written in the measured, careful language of a career military officer who understood that every word in an official document carries weight, was this: the misidentified wildlife classification does not adequately account for the consistency, geographic distribution, and behavioral specificity of the reports reviewed. A more thorough investigation is recommended before this category is closed. 37 reports. Not one patrol's strange night in the jungle. Not 2 soldiers who had been awake too long. 37 separate filed reports from different units, different provinces, different years, all describing encounters consistent enough that a senior officer with 3 Vietnam tours behind him looked at the official explanation and could not make himself sign off on it. The final sentence of the memorandum, the last line on the last page before everything else was taken away and locked behind redactions, reads, whatever these men encountered, they encountered the same thing. Whatever these men encountered, they encountered the same thing. Sherrill's request for reclassification was declined. No formal inquiry was opened. The 37 reports remained filed under Misidentified Wildlife. Major Sherrill retired from the Army in 1976. He gave no interviews. He made no public statements about his memorandum or its contents. He died in Fayetteville, North Carolina, in 2001. The memorandum sat in a file for almost 30 years before anyone outside the building it was stored in knew it existed. Here is the thing that stays with me about all of this. There is a version of this story where the psychological explanation is correct, where combat stress and sleep deprivation and the particular darkness of the Central Highlands jungle combined to produce, in dozens of trained, serious, experienced men, a shared perceptual event that felt completely real and left no physical evidence because there was no physical evidence to leave. That version is possible. I want to be honest with you about that. It is possible. But here is the question I keep coming back to. Combat soldiers are not inexperienced observers of threat. They are among the most specifically trained threat identification specialists that human civilization has ever produced. A Special Forces reconnaissance operator who has completed selection, the Q course, and multiple combat deployments has spent years having his perceptual accuracy tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. His ability to distinguish between a real threat and an ambiguous stimulus in low light, in high stress, in complete exhaustion is not diminished by combat. In many important ways, it is sharpened by it. So when we say combat stress explains these accounts, We are simultaneously arguing that the conditions that create the world's most reliable threat observers also make those same observers completely unreliable, that the training that sharpens perception also destroys it, that the men most specifically qualified to accurately report what they saw are the men least qualified to be believed. That is a strange kind of logic. And then there is the deeper question, the one that the French colonial record and the Montagnard oral tradition and Major Sherrill's 7 unredacted words all point toward together, like 3 separate fingers pointing at the same spot on a map. If the war did not create this, if this was documented before the war, survived the war, and was being carefully avoided by indigenous communities who had been living in those mountains for centuries before any outside force arrived, what does it mean that the forest has always had a name for this and we have not? The soldiers who came home from the Central Highlands, the ones who filed those 37 reports, and the others who filed nothing at all. Most of them never spoke of it publicly. Some of them spoke of it once, in letters, in private conversations, in the kind of quiet that only comes very late at night, when the distance from the jungle finally feels safe enough to think about. Not one of them, in any account I have found, claimed certainty about what they saw. But not one of them, in any account I have found, ever said they thought it was nothing. The jungle breathes at night, old places do, and some of them have been breathing long enough to remember things we have already forgotten. Now I want to hear from you. Which of those 4 theories sits closest to what you believe? The psychology, the wildlife, the operations, or the one that was there long before the war ever started? Drop it in the comments right now. I read every single one, I always do. Let's actually talk about this. We set a goal of 10 likes today. 10. If we crossed it, that is you. That is your support telling me this kind of content is worth making. If we have not crossed it yet, right now is your moment. It genuinely means everything to a channel this size. Next time, we go even deeper. A different war, a different continent, and a mystery that took 60 years for the people involved to even admit had happened at all. The account exists, the documentation exists, and the explanation that was officially given is even less convincing than Misidentified Wildlife. Subscribe so you do not miss it. I will see you in the dark.